Recently, I received a very sweet message on Etsy. The buyer asked me if I'd be willing to create a custom sculpture inspired by their pet hamster Fuzzball, who had just recently passed. She wrote a very heartfelt message explaining how much the custom item would mean to her, emphasizing how great of an impact her pet had made on her. Attached was a picture of her hamster, and, as if I hadn't already felt compelled enough to do this, the giant and gentle black little eyes staring back at me on my screen made it literally impossible not to commit myself fully to the idea. So, after reading the message and after having had my heartstrings effectively pulled out, I made sure to respond as promptly as I could.
I will do my duty. You must do your duty too.
I know.
You have to keep Father safe.
At the time of her message, I had also been going through my own sort of mourning, after having lost my own pet hamster, Smo. I had also just finished sculpting Us from Baldur's Gate 3, and was editing the first part of the video, which became the first video I ever created for this channel. When I had Smo, I always prided myself on everything I made with her at my side. She was there with me from the beginning of this entire journey, right from when I first started sculpting, and she was the inspiration behind my first few pieces that the buyer had been inspired by for her own hamster. I'll never forget that I lost Smo right as I had finished making Us's third leg. Although I was getting so close, she never got to see that brain dog finished, but she was there through the bulk of what might have been the hardest part of making the brain, which were those tiny little legs and claws. By the time I was working on the third leg with her around, I had gained a lot more confidence in what I was doing. The initial stress of it had melted away by that point. Whenever I was stressed working, there she was, calm, happy, and soothing to be around. Anyway, while I was very interested in working with the buyer to recreate her very own fuzzball sculpture, I was a little conflicted since I was in the midst of one of my most complicated projects to date, and I was very determined to see through what I was working on at the time. All I had left to do was paint the sculpture, and make the second part of its video. I also had never really been open to making custom orders before. But, like I said, the idea of doing this for someone quickly became something I cared about deeply. So, after a small conversation, wishing her my condolences and sharing that I had gone through a similar loss myself, I asked if she would be okay to wait, making sure she knew I didn't know exactly when I would be done, but that I hoped that I could have my Us project done within the next month. I tend to be overly ambitious with timelines, as I did end up going over that estimate by about 2 weeks, but the buyer was incredibly kind and excited throughout our time messaging each other. So, I pulled out my blonde and gray hamsters for reference, but told myself that this time I would make this next one, inspired by Fuzzball, to be a little more polished looking. I wanted the sculpture to remain similar, but I also wanted to put some of the things I had learned over the last 2 years of sculpting to the test. I have 2 main goals I'd like to achieve in order for me to accomplish this in my mind. I'd like to make this hamster more flush to the ground, so that there aren't any floating edges. And I'd like to try to paint the fur in a more realistic way, especially considering the complexity of color in Fuzzball's coat. So, let's get started. Grabbing some tinfoil, I'll fold down a sheet into the same similar disc shape I made for my original pancaked ham sculptures. This shape will help bulk out our sculpture, ensure the clay bakes evenly, and it will help me decide which end will be his face or his backside. The first versions of these sculptures were made with translucent Sculpey 3 clay. Most of my first sculptures were either made with some sort of Sculpey 3 and translucent, elephant gray, or translucent mix with other basic tones from the Fimo line of clay. I have since discovered Cosclay though, and will be using it today. Cosclay is a sort of hybrid polyamor clay that cures with a slightly flexible, rubber-like quality to it. It's a much less fragile clay, and is much more suitable for more intricate projects, and is certainly suitable to make a fuzzball guy. Once the clay is conditioned well enough from squishing and warming it up, I'll use it to cover up our tinfoil saucer. I'll start layering on more mass to the top of the sculpture, beginning to imagine and form the little spine of our creature. I'm going to make the sculpture look like a hamster in a flat and pancaked form, which is a thing by the way. It's actually a pose that can be observed in hamsters when they have all their guards down. Generally only then you will find them in this shape, which is a fitting shape for Fuzzball especially, as I was told that they would often relax just like it while being pet by their owner. Which is truly a sign of achieving like the ultimate bond and level of trust with a hamster. Even though this form is called pancaking, These little guys do have spines and other small working parts inside, and I like to try to represent some of those forms to bring just a touch of realism to the design. So I'll begin adding more mass to begin to suggest that there is a hamster-shaped frame underneath the fluff. Speaking of pancaking, and going back to the fuzzball having an affinity for pancaking, it's a pretty rare thing, at least in my experiences. Some hamsters just won't bond with their owner in that way, but it doesn't mean you won't be able to still have a special relationship with them. It may just be a different sort of bond, or they may just decide to hate you for no reason, and that's okay. They still deserve a home and love. But I will not lie, I do hope that one day I get to experience something as cute. I want to improve the way their little tail looks. The first versions of this sculpture had tails that just sort of stick right out, and this time around I noticed in reference photos I gathered of hamsters laying down similarly that their tails sometimes look as though the tail folds into the body, with fur surrounding it in this position. So I carve out a little hole and place inside a little nub of a tail. This is going to add a bit more depth and detail that the first iteration of the pancake design didn't have. Next, I'll lay down the start of what will eventually become his ears. To do this, I'll take a small piece of clay, stretch and thin it out in my hand, and then fold two ends into each other, sealing them down onto the head with more clay. I'll stop here for now and return to the ears later. Having their placement set will help me to visualize where the other facial features fit. The nose, mouth, and chin of a hamster are pretty detailed, and they all connect together, so it will take quite a few steps to make them correctly. I'll roll out some balls of clay and place them down to represent their nose, lips, and mouth. I'll continue to build on the shapes, adding more dimension to each area. The long rolled up clay is there to help further imagine the anatomy of the hamster skull and how it connects to the part of the face I'm currently working on, as well as to help me picture the eyes of the fuzzball hamster. Even in my original design, the lower half of the face was always the most detailed part of the sculpture. I think the little mouths and noses of hamsters are just about one of the cutest things out there, so I like to spend a good amount of time on it. Since our object is 3D, I'll make sure to flip over the sculpture to work on the chin. If you look at the anatomy of most animals, you'll notice that their upper and lower jaw are not perfectly aligned. Most animals have a pretty strong overbite. To help solve this skeletal feature, I'll make sure the chin is placed further back, sort of underneath the upper lips and mouth. When a hamster is in a pancake pose, sometimes their chin is completely tucked underneath their body. Not always, though. I would know, because my hamster Smo could regularly be found pancaking on top of one of her tunnel tubes. Chin revealed and all. It had to be one of the cutest things in the world to me, so I've sculpted the chins this way thanks to those precious memories. I mentioned before that there are a lot of steps involved in this process, and I was hoping to be able to share them more thoroughly than I was able to capture on my camera. I never really know when my hands are covering up the action, and finding those moments where they aren't has to be one of the most annoying things about making these videos. Back when I made my first series of hamster sculptures, I always spent so much time on each one. Depending on their pose, their faces, and their bodies, their appearance can change so much. They are one of the most confusing animals to sculpt to me because of this. They are like little jelly puddles, changing shape in the way they look constantly. Some of their features I got to know very well through studying images online, and through the pictures I would take of my own hamsters. Some might like to make comparisons of these features to brand logos, and while some might see a Tesla logo for a nose or a Mercedes-Benz in place of a mouth, I personally see a little alien creature. The nose of a hamster in particular is something that can be so easily represented and interpreted in our minds as just a dot in a drawing or even a sculpture. But I am personally here for what it truly is, something more complicated than a Tesla symbol or a small drawn circle. If you take a close look at any of the work I've done of a hamster, you'll notice they have these rounded caps as the bulk of their shape, and a line that splits down from the height of their nostrils and meets the split section of their lips cleanly. But that's just one part of the nose. I sort of look at their nose as two pieces of a puzzle. We have a mushroom up top and another shape underneath that. On a hamster, there tends to be a defined separation from three sides, like an open box where the nose is placed inside. The top of the nose has just a little bit of fur that hangs over top the cap of the mushroom. Basically, just think alien, not some basic Tesla BS. Once I'm happier with how this section looks, I'll continue to build around their face until things feel and look right. I want to represent the skull and how their faces taper into a triangular shape at their jaw. I just need to make sure it's still kind of an amorphous, melted version of this too. Sort of like when we sit down and our thighs go from something like this to this. After fixating on that for a while, I'll bounce back to the ears. They aren't quite as finished up as I would like them to be. I'm going to focus on thinning out the ears, while also adding bulk around them to make them connect to the top and back of their head. The area is so delicate to work with that I'll often use the back of my nail for support underneath the ear while I'm tampering around it. I'll be taking a close look at reference pictures of ears and how they look when hamsters are relaxed. I'm pretty positive that hamster ears will lay flatter to their body when they are feeling calm. Think of how a bunny perks up their ears when they are on alert. I believe hamsters do the same sort of thing. We want the fuzzball to look relaxed, so I'll be trying to fold the ears down and back as realistically as possible. After all that, I'll smooth out the ham with some alcohol and then roll out a tiny amount of gray clay to define Fuzzball's sleepy eyes. Then I'll let it sit overnight to thoroughly dry to be extra careful that our boy will not crack in the oven. Then, in the morning, I'll bake the sculpture before moving on to sculpting the underside. Once I retrieved the boy from the oven, I noticed that there was a small crack on his belly. I feel certain that this is because alcohol got trapped from underneath them from the previous night. At least it's a very small, surface level crack that will be an easy fix. All I'll need to do is lay down a bit of liquid polyamber clay and simply cover it up with some more clay. No one except us here watching will ever know. The crack definitely did not affect the integrity of the sculpture, and we learned a lesson. Tummies gotta breathe sometimes too. So next time, we will give future tummies the proper chance to aerate. Once the tummy is well smoothed out and flat, I'll carve out 4 little pockets to put the feet in. I'll then plop down tiny pieces of clay into those pockets and get to work. With my previous versions of this style of sculpture, these feet were basically just smushed down shapes. Not that I didn't spend any time on them at all, they were just pretty basic. This is one of those areas I'd like to try to do a little better at this time. When Smo passed, my partner convinced us to get her footprints pressed into clay, which at the time I wasn't sure about, but I'm glad we did. Whenever I felt down or was feeling stuck in my feelings of missing her, I could place my fingers inside her footprints, and every time it gave me comfort, just like I hope this commission will for the buyer. So it occurred to me that I could try to do the same thing with this sculpture by making the little hands feel real. My only worry is that maybe they'll look a little less cute this way, but I don't know. We'll see. I'm glad I made this attempt in the long run. Here's a side-by-side of what the feet were like on the previous versions. It's an improvement, I guess, right? I even tried to add tiny fingernails to each hand, but it wasn't a super easy task. This entire thing was very meaningful for me to do, so I think it was worth it in the long run. All that's left to do now is bake the sculpture once more to set their underside. Then, I'll prep them for painting by giving the full sculpture a light sanding. Let's take a second to appreciate the colors of Fuzzball's coat. Dwarf hamsters come in a variety of colors of coats. This is representative of one of the darker brown shades that you can see. Smo, for example, also had brown fur, but she was much more of a toasted marshmallow type shade compared to Fuzzball. Fuzzball's coat looks as though there is a very dark brown color at the root of his hair strand, lightening some at the ends of each. He also has that same toasted yellow shade that fades at his sides where the brown fur meets the white fur on his tummy. I wanted to challenge myself with this paint job. I spent over a week searching for various tutorials and painstakingly trying different techniques over and over. Cutting up brushes, and even trying out some of my favorite brushes I would use to paint mascara onto clients' eyelashes when I was a makeup artist. It was very hard. I wanted so badly to be able to do this, but instead just found myself admiring the work of others, and how disciplined they must have been to get there. I learned it was basically silly of me to have expected myself to master another format of painting within a week's time. This style of art is so beautiful, and so different than anything I've ever done. So I eventually found myself bowing out after the week I spent trying over and over again, and decided I would find my own way. Something that could still represent Fuzzball and look nice, but not quite as I had originally hoped for myself. You might wonder why I was so hard on myself over this, why I kept striving to do better than I had before with this commission. And it's simply because, to me, it felt like a way of showing respect to the life of something so deserving of that kind of attention and love. When I had my past 2 pets, I often found myself having to explain to other people why I decided to own a hamster as a pet. People would say things like, "Oh, I could never. They only live for 2 years. That's so sad." And while it is sad, the impact that they can have on you is so much grander than can easily be explained to anyone. Our understanding of the creatures have grown so much over the past few years, and thankfully because of this, we can provide them greater qualities of life than ever before. It's something really special, and it really isn't easy to explain to other people, but I know that I really do get it. It's a bit of a fickle thing though. The hamster community can be a little intense and attack others who they think are not up to today's standards, and I think it's a shame for people to approach educating others this way. It is something that should be handled delicately. We all care about our pets, and lashing out at someone can make someone feel quite terribly. Learning about the new standards might even make someone feel badly about how they have cared for a hamster 10 years ago or even longer, back when they were a kid and didn't know any better. I never want anyone to feel badly for their mistakes, so if you're watching this now and this has stirred up any bad feelings inside, please know that this is not my intention, and I know that you had nothing but love for your pets. When I was reached out to about this commission, in the inquiring message I got, the buyer was trying to explain to me the impact a fuzzball left on them. I'm not sure I was able to effectively communicate just how well I understood that. And it's sadly something I think hamster owners are used to doing, because some people will just never get it. Just like their lives, our own are so individual too, and depending on our life experience, sometimes we just can't relate. This is something I did relate to very well, and it was the most powerful motivator to me towards this entire process. Even to now, making this video has been one of the most difficult things I've ever done, but I'm glad I'm here doing it. So, let's finish this thing up, so I can send out the sculpture in honor of Fuzzball's memory. I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to do the paint job, but before I got started, I mixed up a decent amount of paint to create a custom base color that I thought suited Fuzzball's coat color overall. When held up to the reference images I received, I was pretty content with how well it matched. I put the mix into a special container so that I could keep it to use over the next few days. I'll gently start laying out the color onto the back of the sculpture, thinning it out, and slowly spreading it out into the shape I want. Most dwarf hamsters have a very similar pattern to the pigmented section of fur on their back. It's rare to see it otherwise. Now that the pattern is mostly established, I've realized that I usually like to paint in their nose, mouth, ears, and feet before I begin with the body of the hamster. I guess I was so taken by my custom mix of color that I forgot my own preferences for a second. To paint them, I grab out some alcohol inks and mix out a suitable shade. These paints are quite translucent in nature, so I find them especially perfect for these features. Especially the ears. The ears of a hamster are so thin that you can sometimes even see the veins that run through them if enough light is catching them. I'll return back to the brown fur and slowly deepen up the shade little by little. I decide to accent some areas with a much darker brown. I also notice just a few deeper spots of color at the tips of Fuzzball's ears, so I make sure to repeat the same deeper colors there, representative of the deeper shade at the root of Fuzzball's fur. In my mind, framing just some sections is a tell of the darker color being visible, dependent on how their hair is shifted around, not just a perfect frame around the entire pattern. I'll blend these sections out, and then even out the brown shade on the back some more. Now that this part of the paint job is coming together, I'll take out a yellow tone and blend it outside of the brown color, making sure to do this right around the mouth. Another cute feature I love that most dwarf hamsters have. I'll blend out those toasted yellow details soon. I suppose here I decided I was ready to bite the bullet and paint the dorsal stripe down their back. This is probably the most nerve-wracking part of painting a hamster sculpture. There really isn't much room for error, so I want to make sure that it's not off-center from its tail to the top of its head and in between the ears. So here I go, holding my breath, concentrating, and praying I don't mess it up. I'll paint the line very thin to start, thickening it up slowly as I gain more confidence in its placement. And then I'll try to blend out the top and bottom of the stripe so it's not quite as harsh looking, as well as paint a very thin, watery layer of brown on top of the stripe to soften the whole look. This technique is called glazing, something I saw used very frequently to change the tone of color when painting fur and hair. Now it's time to clean up and blend out that yellow shade I laid down. I'll do this by dry brushing various white tones around over the yellow, reapplying the yellow when needed. I bounce around using 3 different tones of white, 2 different warm tones, and a cooler white. The cool white I use very minimally. This is another thing that was pretty stressed by other artists when painting animals with white fur. It is never just a solid tone of white. Most artists like to work from deeper tones, working their way up to using lighter ones. There is much layering involved, but I was pretty happy with how the toasted white details came out in the end. I guess that week spent studying what others were doing was fairly helpful after all. The techniques that I was seeing were used by me more than I realized at first. As this is, of course, me from the future, re-evaluating what steps I took to finish this. So hurrah, perhaps I should be kinder to myself, and congratulate myself on trying to grow, and for having grown even more than my past self could see. The very last thing I'll do is use my mascara brush I mentioned earlier from my makeup artistry days to attempt to paint a small bit of hair on top of the pink feet. There's at least another touch of hair strokes on the sculpture after all. At least very basic ones that I was confident enough to place down without destroying the whole thing. Now, there's only one thing left to do to finish up our Ode to Fuzzball sculpture. I'll apply a thin layer of an extra matte varnish to the top and bottom of the sculpture to give it a nice soft finish, as well as to protect the paint. Once all that is dried and safe to handle, I'll sculpt one last thing for Fuzzball. A perfectly measured and carved out foam box to provide them the safest and comfiest travels possible to their new forever home. I'm always pretty nervous sending anything I've made out to someone. What if something terrible happens to the sculpture? What if they don't like it? Well, it ended up being the happiest result I could have wished for. Not only did the sculpture arrive safe and sound to their new home, they were received with a great deal of love. Just check out this review the buyer kindly left for me. I'll try to read it out now without choking up. Absolutely beautiful. My hamster Fuzzball passed away a few months ago, and the seller was so kind. She made a replica of him for me. Whenever I would pet him, he would melt into a pancake, just like this. I'm so grateful I can hold him again, even though he is just here in spirit. Jessica Rose is an extremely talented artist. I definitely recommend purchasing from her and following her on her YouTube channel. I couldn't have asked for a happier ending to this story. I feel very thankful for being trusted with this task, and all the way through making it. It helped challenge me, as well as helped to heal me from my own similar loss. It was one of those moments where I was like, yep, this is why I like doing this. I'm not sure I've experienced anything more rewarding. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. I really hoped you enjoyed your time here listening to the behind the scenes story of making Fuzzball the hamster. Rest in peace, little one. And a big thank you as well to their owner who agreed to allow me to make this video featuring them. If you like this video, be sure to hit the like button, and if you'd like to see more like this video, be sure to hit the subscribe button, as I will be uploading many more like it to come. Eventually. It takes me a long time, and I am a team of one, but I do not plan on stopping anytime soon, and I'd be happy to have any new supporting friends here. So, until next time, you can find me on all socials at SoClayAboutThis, where I provide lots of updates and behind the scenes content. Cheers, and as always, it's been real guys. Hope to see you in the next one.